Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the current market cycle. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, a lot of times when the market's moving like this, it makes sense to take a step back and say, where are we in the market cycle? Like, what does this look like the most? Are we on track? Are we not? You know, are we getting a little bit too heated, or is this perfectly normal? And so that's what I want to do in this video. We'll talk about sort of the most likely path. We'll talk about a couple of other outcomes, but that's what I want to do in this video. The first thing to remember is how we got here. And how we got here was back in March, I said that Bitcoin would likely put in a series of lower highs over the span of about 6 to 9 months and then break out and go to new all-time highs. The reason I said that is because last cycle, it took about 6 to 9 months for Bitcoin to break out, right? We got a landing back then, right? After the breakout, we got a landing. So there is always a chance that something like that happens. It's not the outcome that you should be considering necessarily the most probable, but it is an outcome to consider. Again, no one knows what the market holds at the end of the day, right? Everyone thinks we know, but no one actually knows. We're all students of the market, and things can be, thrown off course at any moment. But what I would say is this, right? What I would say is that when the unemployment rate came in at 4.1%, it made sense to assume the cyclical view would prevail. And I've been saying that for the last couple of weeks, right? And the reason why is because Bitcoin needs a reason to go down, not a reason to go up. If you look at the unemployment rate, you could argue that it was in fact the unemployment rate that was causing Bitcoin to go down, because while the unemployment rate was moving up quickly here, Bitcoin was going down. But as the unemployment rate came back down, Bitcoin started to go back up. And then Bitcoin paused here in early November. I said it would likely pause here, wait for the unemployment rate, and then make the decision. And that's exactly what it did, right? It came back up here, it paused, it waited for the unemployment rate, the labor market data to come in. The unemployment rate came in at 4.1%, and then Bitcoin broke out. And it makes sense because, again, the market needs a reason to go down, not a reason to go up. It goes up naturally because people just DCA Bitcoin. It needs a reason to go down, and that would be the labor market. The labor market was weak for a little while there, but then recently it started to, cool off a little bit. And Bitcoin can't wait forever, right? If the unemployment rate's not going to go up, then Bitcoin is going to go up. So that's why the cyclical view remains the most likely view. It could theoretically change if Bitcoin were to go back below 70K, right? If Bitcoin finds itself below $70,000, then there is a chance that the cyclical view ultimately won't prevail in Q4. But the reality, and by the way, as I'm making this video, Bitcoin just hit 78K. But the reality is that when you look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in Q4 of halving years, Bitcoin normally goes up in Q4 of halving years, right? That's when it normally goes up. If you look at the ROI from the low, Bitcoin around this time normally goes up, right? So the price action you're seeing by Bitcoin is actually really normal, right? This is what it normally does at this point in the cycle. It's not, something that's entirely unpredictable. It's what normally happens. This is what happened in Q4 of 2020, in Q4 of 2016, and in Q4 of 2012. So the cyclical view continues to be the dominant view. And so what I think makes the most amount of sense, as I've been saying, is to defer to the cyclical view, right? To ride that momentum until we really have a reason to believe the momentum's no longer there. And for now, it just seems like the easiest strategy. I've said for 3 years to stay Bitcoin heavy. Now that Bitcoin dominance hit 60%, I think it makes sense to hedge a little bit. And I already said that I have, right? I already said that I've already started to hedge with some ETH. And I know some people have a problem me saying that because they're like, well, what about ETH going home? I can't get everything right. And as far as ETH Bitcoin goes, ETH Bitcoin went to my target range, 0.03 to 0.04. So for me, that's good enough, right? I value my portfolio in terms of Satoshis, not US dollars. I'll put out predictions about US dollars, but those will mostly be wrong. If the Bitcoin valuation goes to an area that I find attractive, then I start to diversify into that asset, right? I don't care if my USD valuation prediction comes true or not. So from here, the question, of course, would be, well, has ETH Bitcoin actually bottomed? Have altcoins actually bottomed against Bitcoin? And has Bitcoin dominance actually topped? One of the things I mentioned is that we would likely see a pullback by Bitcoin dominance after the second rate cut, because we saw one after the first rate cut, right? First rate cut, second rate cut. My speculation is this. I think that there will be one more move up by Bitcoin dominance that will finalize in December. But it is not clear if that will actually be a higher high or a lower high. If it's a higher high, I think it will only be a marginally higher high. It won't go that much higher, in my opinion. One way to visualize that is to look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins. So if you look at it excluding stablecoins, we've been talking about this for 3 years, that it would likely top out at around 65%, right? That's exactly where it went. I said 65% excluding stables and 60% including stables. And that's exactly where it hit. So for me, I'm satisfied for Bitcoin dominance. Like, I don't feel like it needs to go higher to make my view sound. I think that 60% is good enough. There is a reality that if it does something like this, it could go a little bit higher, right? Here in June of 2021, it hit a high, collapsed, and then went back up and then swept the high. So it is possible. And you want to know some other evidence that it's possible? Well, there's two. If you were to look at alt, and listen, guys, I know everyone wants to just go all in on alt season. The reality is that altcoins, as long as Bitcoin keeps doing well, altcoins will likely keep doing well, right? And so if Bitcoin's riding the momentum, altcoins are going to ride it too. So ever since dominance hit 60%, I think it makes sense to be bullish on alt Bitcoin pairs. But there is one thing you should keep in mind. I remember back in 2020 distinctly when altcoins started to rally against Bitcoin in mid-November, right? They rallied in mid-November. If you look right here, this week was November 16th. They got a 2-week rally. And everyone thought, for the most part, that Bitcoin dominance had topped. But then Bitcoin dominance, alt Bitcoin pairs had one last drop into the end of the halving year, right? Going into the end of the halving year, they had one final drop that no one really was expecting. And then alt Bitcoin pairs durably went up. Now, it's possible that we're already at this point where they're already durably going up. But I just want to put that idea out there that there does exist a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs drop one more time in December of 2024. And the other thing to consider too is that you could argue this is also a mix of the cyclical view and the monetary policy view. Because remember, last cycle, we know that alt Bitcoin pairs did not actually bottom until the Fed began QE. Right? When they began QE, that's when alt Bitcoin pairs actually bottomed. So there's a chance that alt Bitcoin pairs are sort of doing the same type of thing, but they're just in this 2-week rally, right? A 2-week alt Bitcoin pair rally before then dropping one last time to mark the true bottom of alt Bitcoin pairs. There is a chance that that is what is going on, right? Whether you look at the cyclical view or the monetary policy view. So you might say, well, Ben, if all Bitcoin pairs were to drop, how would Bitcoin dominance not go much higher than 6%? Well, I think the answer lies with ETH Bitcoin. There is a chance that ETH Bitcoin has bottomed. I think there's a higher chance that ETH Bitcoin has bottomed than alt Bitcoin pairs, because ETH Bitcoin, historically, once it durably breaks down in years where ETH Bitcoin breaks down, once it breaks down below support, once it gets back above the 50-day moving average, the low is in, right? You can see that's what happened in 2019, is what happened in 2016, And now ETH Bitcoin is back above its 50-day moving average. So I would argue there is a good chance that the bottom for ETH Bitcoin is already in. I would point out that in November of 2020, ETH Bitcoin also got a rally, right? It got, and if you look at if you take a bar pattern on the rally that it got back over here, and you sort of carry it out, and then you overlay it with what's going on today, you can see that it basically got a very similar type of rally, right? It would correspond to maybe going up to 0.042, 0.043, which just happens to be, by the way, where the bull market support band is, right? Going right up to around 0.042 to 0.043. There's a chance that that happens, and then it goes down and puts in one final low closer to 0.03. I've often said by the end of the year, I've often said that 0.03 is the worst case scenario for ETH Bitcoin. 0.03. It's possible that 0.03 happens. It might not, and I'm not willing to wait for that. I think it already makes sense to own ETH, but it's possible that that happens, right? So I think the best strategy for now, as I've said, was to just follow the cyclical view until it gives us a reason not to, right? Don't fade the momentum. Fading the momentum typically doesn't work out, right? So go, defer to the cyclical view for as long as possible, because it's just the easiest strategy to defer to the cyclical view. And I've thought about that, and it's worked out so far this year, right? We set a 6 to 9 month drop followed by a breakout to new all-time highs. That happened. It just seems like the easiest thing to ride the ROI cycle, right? Ride the ROI from the lows, ride the year-to-date ROI. If you look at the year-to-date ROI, just to ride that general move and not worry so much about other outcomes. It just seems like the easiest thing to do. There are things that we could look at to make us worried, right? But that is the easiest thing to do. And that is likely going to serve you the best. Probably now, but also just in the future. In general, riding that is likely the best thing to do. More times than not. There are cases to be made that you could get a landing to temporarily derail things exactly when no one expects it. That's essentially what happened last cycle, and again, at this point, it's not the most likely outcome. Hell, Bitcoin is almost at 79K. But if you look at essentially what happened last cycle, the landing started 33 weeks, right? The top before the landing occurred 33 weeks after the mid-cycle top. So if you go to this mid-cycle top here in March, we're on week 34, I believe, right? From the high. Yeah, week 34. So, we're around that time where if the landing is going to play out like it did over here, that's when you would generally expect it to occur, around this time. But you can't go into it assuming the COVID crash has to happen, right? You can't assume that. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I can overlay it and show you that it looks similar, but I can also tell you it's probably not the most likely outcome, right? It's probably not. I'm just going to put it out there because I think as an investor, we must consider all outcomes. We can't be blinded by one outcome and assume it has to happen. But I was thinking, I've gotten a lot of flack about the ETH going home theory. And, I've already accepted, right? I'm probably wrong, right? I'm probably wrong about that, which is why I've already started to actively hedge against it. I'm betting against that view at this point because I already converted some to ETH. But I was trying to think, is there a scenario where December gets here and ETH goes home? And my answer is probably not, right? My answer is probably not, right? It probably doesn't, but it's not like there's no possible outcome where it occurs. If you ran a simulation, right? If you go through maybe if you look at the parallel universe, and you look at all the different worlds that exist, there's probably a few where it still goes home this year. In the majority of them, it probably doesn't, right? And just continues to sort of get that rally. But I was trying to think, is there any evidence that it might happen? And the truth is, I can't really find a lot, right? I can't really find a lot. which is why I generally defer to the cyclical view of Bitcoin at this point. And if Bitcoin goes up, it's going to take ETH with it, is the reality, you know. Um, but with that said, anything's possible. Anything's possible. In fact, in the .com era, when things were probably about just as crazy as they are now, there was a pretty big pullback after a sizable rally, right? And I was looking at that and thinking, a couple of things. First of all, if you look at the QQQ, the first thing to note is that when it launched in 1999, it launched in March, and then the market topped a year later in March. What's really interesting about that is that when it launched at around 48, which is exactly where Bitcoin was when its ETF launched, 48,000. And then it topped at 120 a year later, right? Exactly 1 year later. Well, Bitcoin USD ETF launched the first week of January of 2024. So if the cyclical view pans out, what if Bitcoin just rallies into the end of the year, right? What if it rallies into the end of the year and dominance hits some major top, and then the market cools off for a while, right? Kind of like it did back then. That's always an outcome, and it's not entirely unheard of, right? I mean, if you look at the S&P in, back in the 1970s during periods of high inflation, after the low that the S&P had in October of 66, it rallied until December of 68, that would correspond to next month, right? If you look at the low in 1970, May of 1970, then the S&P then topped out in January of 73, right? Which would be corresponding to 2 months from now, right? So it's possible that Bitcoin just rallies into the beginning of the year, and then that's it, right? There's a chance that that's what happens. But I was looking around and I was like, well, that seems like a decent outlook, right? It's possible that happens. But there's also this other thing kind of bugs me about that view, right? That bugs me about that view is that normally Bitcoin doesn't top at the end of halving years, but it also doesn't normally put in all-time highs before the halving either. So it's always worthwhile to consider the left translated cycle as a potential view, right? I've always said it does hold some validity. It might not be, what you might consider the most likely outcome, but you can't ignore it, right? There's a chance that that's what happens. And so I think it makes sense to have that mindset in the, sort of in the back of our mind. If by the end of the year, if Bitcoin has rallied on up above 100K and everyone's just absolutely euphoric and it feels like things can't possibly get any better, there's a chance that that plays out. But there's also this reality with Bitcoin that we've historically seen where it typically tops out in December of the post-halving year, right? Q4 2013, Q4 2017, and Q4 2021. So if it were to top out in January and you were to go look at the ROI from the low, I mean, it would be topping, essentially here-ish, right? Whereas if you look at the last two cycles, Bitcoin's cycle continued to go on for a lot longer. Now, you might look at market cycle 2 and say, well, that's how long that one took. But that's not even really that accurate because I think the argument, though, is that really market cycle 1 and market cycle 2 should probably be combined because they were all sort of around, sort of the launch of Bitcoin and then going into the first halving, right? So it probably would make sense to sort of combine these. And this one took, 525 days. And then that one took, around 400 days. So if you combine them, then you get about 900 to 1,000 days or so, which is approximately how long the other ones took. So that's what kind of bugs me with a left translated view is that then Bitcoin will be topping a full year sooner than it normally does, which I'm not completely against that idea. I mean, I can imagine a scenario where that occurs, especially if the unemployment rate really starts to pick up in 2025, which it feels like it's been building out a big base. It very well could play out like that. And so that's one potential outcome. But there is one way that I've already decided in my own mind, right? I can't, I can't look at the market and say that the most likely outcome is for ETH to go home if Bitcoin continues this rally, right? In order for ETH to go home, it would more or less need to get rejected relatively soon and start to head back the other way. So I was looking back at the .com era, and I was like, well, the only way that ETH is going to go down is if Bitcoin goes down. But the only way that Bitcoin's going to go down is if the stock market goes down. How can Bitcoin go down now if the stock market doesn't go down, right? Bitcoin it has everything going for it right now, right? I mean, the election results obviously have been a tailwind. The general seasonality has been a tailwind. The ROI from the cycle low seems to be a tailwind. It just seems like, it has a lot going for it, right? So how do you fade that? The answer is you probably don't, right? You probably don't fade it. You ride it as long as you can is, I think, the right answer. But I mean, look, there's a small chance that the market gets derailed for whatever reason. And what's interesting, I was actually looking at the S&P divided by M2, and this is an interesting thing because it could easily be sort of disproven this coming week, which is why I think it makes sense to look at it. My strategy for the S&P is I just DCA low expense ratio index funds and forget about everything else. Sometimes I'll buy individual stocks. Like I mentioned, I bought Tesla. But for the most part, I just buy low expense ratio index funds. What's interesting is that going into the .com era, there was a low set by the S&P. This is the S&P divided by M2. There was a low set in the summer of 96. And that same low is what we hit in October of 2022. What's really interesting is it rallied up for a little over 100 weeks to the exact level that it just hit here, which is exactly where the S&P divided by M2 just went to. And you can see that it took place over around the same amount of time, right? If you from the low to that high was about 105 weeks back then, from this low to the current high, about 105 weeks, right? And I'm not sure if I got that exact, right? But it's around the same amount. So there's part of me that thinks like, if ETH were to go home, like if you were to say to me, it goes home in December, and you told me to backtrack, how it actually happened, I would have to go to the stock market and say there has to be a correction in the stock market to make it happen. Because if there's a stock market correction, then of course that would affect Bitcoin. And if there's a Bitcoin correction, then it would affect Ethereum. So that is one way that you could get to a normal market cycle peak by Bitcoin in Q4 of the post-halving year, right? You get a correction within the next month or two that makes everyone think that it's over, and then you get one final year rally, and then it's actually over, when it normally is over in Q4 of the post-halving year. So that's the other outcome, right? And I don't know what exactly, is going to happen, obviously. I think for now, just deferring to the cyclical view has just been the easiest thing to do, especially with the unemployment rate coming in where it is. And to think about, like, how could the S&P drop that much from here? Like, what catalyst would there be? I don't know, right? I mean, we're not even going to get any more labor market data for almost another month, right? And by that point, Bitcoin would theoretically be higher than it is today, assuming there's no other major shocks to the market from some other completely unforeseen event. So I think it makes sense to look at it and say the most likely outcome is that the cyclical view prevails for Bitcoin, where it goes up in Q4 of the halving year. But if it doesn't prevail, right? Because I don't know. I don't know, I certainly can't know for sure, right? I'll tell you what I think, but it's only what I think. It's not like I know for sure. It seems like the cyclical view is more likely to prevail. If Bitcoin were to go back below 70K, then I would say the cyclical view is going to falter. But that's not the case right now. And until you see a weekly close below 70K, it doesn't make sense to assume it's going to happen, right? I think if you see it, then you're like, oh, well, I guess I guess we are getting the landing now. So that's where I am, is thinking that the cyclical view is the more likely view, as it has been, right? As it has been. I mean, Bitcoin continues to put in new all-time highs today. So by saying the cyclical view has been the right view is correct view. It's just that will it continue to be? And I would say don't fade the momentum until you have a strong reason not to. Um, if if the landing happens, right? If the landing happens, then it's going to have to come from the stock market first, because it's not going to come from Bitcoin first, because that's where the momentum is. Right? It's likely not going to come from Bitcoin first. So that's where I am. Cyclical view still seems to be doing the best. I will defer to that. I don't plan on, I'm not like selling my portfolio in hopes of a landing. I have some cash set aside in case it happens, as I think you should always have some cash set aside in case, there's dips in the market to take advantage of those dips. But that's what I think, right? That's what I think about the market. Cyclical view remains strong. If there's a landing, it would take ETH home. But unfortunately, at this point, for that view, it just seems like it's a hard view to sort of hold on to. I think that, with ETH, I mean, if you look at it here, it seems like it's sort of back testing that. In the only chance that it has to go home is if it just gets rejected here on on this coming week, if the S&P is dropping from, like it did before the finale of the .com era, right? That's the only way. It's the only way. And I got to be honest, right? I mean, because I've already started converting some Bitcoin to ETH, I'm okay if that view is wrong. And, some views come true, some views don't. One of my problems is I make the views, I boldly declare them, and sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. ETH Bitcoin went to where I wanted it to. Bitcoin dominance went to where I wanted it to. Maybe it's just not coming home, Maybe that's the reality. So I've already started to hedge that view by getting some ETH. If it does come home, then we'll welcome it. I'll welcome it home with open arms. But it's just, I'm sure you can understand where I'm coming from, right? I mean, before it seemed like, there's a chance that Bitcoin could go up and ETH could go down like it did in 2016, but that doesn't really seem, and even back then I expressed some, some sort of problem really thinking that could happen. But now, I mean, sort of the hand has been dealt, right? I mean, if Bitcoin's going up, ETH's going to sure as hell follow it. So in order for ETH to go down, Bitcoin would have to go down. In order for Bitcoin to go down, it would have to fade the cyclical view. And the cyclical view still seems pretty strong. We'll see if anything changes this coming week, but I'm guessing I'm just going to be saying more of the same stuff next week and the same stuff the week after that until the end of the year. If anything changes, I'll update that, and we'll look at sort of the other option, right? The other potential outcome. But that's where I stand right now. That is the sort of the cyclical view of Bitcoin. You can see that it is more or less on track right now. In terms of ROI after the cycle low, the year-to-date ROI in the halving year looks more or less on track as it has been for a while. In fact, it's been following 2016 almost perfectly for a long time, and it's actually getting a little bit ahead of it right now. If you look at ROI peak to peak, right, you look at ROI peak to peak, you can see that it's actually right on top of the last cycle. It's still ahead of the prior cycle, suggesting that, all right, well, if it did drop, it would still have plenty of room, wiggle room to continue to carry the cycle forward. But, that's just where we are, guys. Cyclical view remains strong. I wouldn't fade it unless you get a weekly close below 70K. If you get a weekly close below 70K, then you're probably getting a landing, okay? But landings are one of those things where people call for crashes all the time. Most of the time they're wrong, right? And the better strategy with investing is just to assume the markets go up. And for me, all I've really done is stay Bitcoin heavy for the last 3 years. I've started to diversify a little bit with ETH now, but that's my strategy. Anyways, we've gone on long enough, guys. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.